was a van and some plaster, which he then charged out to his first job. So it's a low-cost, low-asset business, and we could sort of truck along that way. If you're looking at something like making a product that does not yet have a market, you're looking at pushing it uphill just a little bit more. It's quite a lot more difficult. But the red tape that goes around with employing people and the responsibility you then have for those people's livelihoods, I think that's what would put me off the most.
Yeah, it certainly doesn't for me. And that I ran the restaurant here for 20 years,
right.
And employed up to 20 people in the summertime, that sort of thing. So it's a culture, really. It's what you enjoy and how you create your job place that makes people happy in it, and we all have a lot of fun. So it's not a worry, and there's not that much red tape.
Hey,
it's easy enough to get round it.
Good luck.
Not get round it, excuse me.
We didn't hear that.
Whoa!
No cash
Work
here.
it out.
Dave.
He was doing so well.
You're doing so well, Dave. Hey, good on you, and all the very best. And thank you very much for sharing all that information with us.
No.
There you go. That's Dave Fowler there, who is doing eco T-shirts in Whitianga. What do you reckon, James?
Well, I think where he started with about having the confidence to do it. And I think that I know a number of people who've gone established their own businesses, and it's taking that step in faith. I can do this. You'll find out how to do the bits and pieces as you get on it. The hardest thing is, am I going to embark on the process? And you don't need to have everything mapped out as to how it's all going to work. And often we could tell some stories about Newsroom, Alexia, when we started. It was a big thing. Basically, just get going, and the rest of those things will fill in. So you don't have to have a tick in every compliance, diligence, planning box before you get underway. But if you've got the confidence to start, the rest of those things will follow.
You hope. Drag everybody along with you.
My husband is a double Olympian. And both our children did his and my sport when young, though not to his level. At one competition, I asked my son if he was going to try for the gold medal. He replied, no, I already have a gold and silver from earlier competitions, so he wanted a bronze medal.
That's cool.
It shows what some kids actually feel about the importance of winning. That is the text of the afternoon. But can you reply back and say a double Olympian in what?
Yes.
Please. I'd love to know. I'm actually burning to know. Text us 2101. Another one here. My family's experience of junior rugby has put my 10-year-old off, even trying other team sports. Sadly, the mentality amongst coaches doesn't encourage ball sharing. The star players start shining young and only pass to other stars. Coaches did nothing to address this. Winning was paramount from the age of 5 or 6 onwards. Thankfully, he's found enjoyment and a chance to do sport through tennis, says Tricia, so that's nice.
Nice. And that's a skill for life.
Yeah.
Yeah, keep playing till you're very old.
I can recall I wasn't such a good team person, James. My 2 games of rugby when I was at primary school, I realised very quickly that it was not my sport.
Not your sport?
What about you?
I played rugby. I held a record for being in the lightest weight grade at secondary school for 3 consecutive years. That had not been done before. So, yeah.
Nice one. All right. Thank you very much for joining us on a Friday. That's James Elliott and Alexia Russell. You've been both wonderful. Thank you to my producer, Melita Tal. I'm Wallace Chapman. Checkpoint next. See you Monday, 3:45.
Kei te whakaronga mai koe ki te reo irarangi o Aotearoa. This is Checkpoint on RNZ National. I'm Nita Blakeperson in for Lisa Owen. E haere aki nei, an apology from the Chief of Defence as a damning report reveals commanders misled ministers and the public over Operation Burnham. A man with terminal cancer tells his heartbreaking story of losing everything to disgraced financial advisor Barry Clue, who befriended him and others, defrauding them of more than $15 million. Victorian authorities threaten a full lockdown if people infected with COVID-19 don't stay home. It comes after door-to-door checks of 500 people yesterday revealed 1 in 4 people with the virus had gone out in public. In the latest Colmar Brunton poll has the ACT Party at 5%. We meet leader David Seymour's 5 running mates. You can watch us live on Facebook, Freeview Channel 50 and Sky Channel 83.
RNZ News at 5. Kia ora, ko Susana Leata with DNA. The government will look at establishing an independent Defence Force watchdog following the release of a scathing report into Operation Burnham. The Burnham inquiry found a child was killed in the 2010 raids of 2 Afghan villages and that the Defence Force misled the public and its minister about the possibility of civilian casualties. Here's our political reporter Katie Scotcher.
The inquiry says while the operation was professional and legal, the Defence Force knew it may have killed or injured civilians, but didn't set the record straight. The Chief of Defence Air Marshal Kevin Short has apologised for the failings and has also accepted the recommendations made in the report. These include a review of the Defence Force organisational structure. The Prime Minister has also committed to making changes and says the government will continue this work if re-elected. Atuiti whare parimata ko Katie Scott Churaho.
The Chief of the Defence Force Air Marshal Kevin Short says senior defence officials failed frontline staff by misleading cabinet ministers and the public.
I accept responsibility for poor management of information and in particular letting down our ministers and government. We should provide them with full information.
Air Marshal Kevin Short. Fear of negative coverage and concerns about animal welfare spurred the government to buy 12,000 pig carcasses during lockdown and give them to food banks. Hundreds of documents related to the government's pandemic response were released today, including a request for Cabinet to approve $5.8 million to buy pork from the oversupply. Officials said culling by farmers who were not equipped to do so would likely attract negative media coverage. New Zealand Pork Chief Executive David Baines says that with independent butchers and restaurants closed, half the market disappeared.
We were at a pretty significant risk of having pigs with no home, and because it's an intensive industry and pigs need to leave farm every week, it was something that had potential immediate consequences.
David Baines says the industry is happy the pork went to food banks. New Zealand's largest mall, Sylvia Park, will be deep cleaned tonight after it was revealed a man diagnosed with COVID-19 in South Korea went to the food court there more than 2 weeks ago. It's unclear how the person contracted the virus, with health authorities unable to rule out that he caught it in New Zealand. Matthew Tunison reports.
The man visited the mall's food court between 11 a.m. and 1 p.m. on Thursday, July the 16th. The Health Ministry says this poses a very low risk, but staff are taking it extremely seriously. The food court was closed today for a deep clean, and the rest of the mall will be cleaned tonight. All of the traveller's family and contacts in New Zealand have tested negative for the coronavirus. Health authorities believe he most likely caught it while in transit. This is Matthew Tunison.
A Canterbury primary school has closed because more than half of its children are sick. Lauriston School, which is inland from Rakaia, has a roll of 99 children and 48 of them have a stomach bug. The principal, Colin Brodie, says the Health Ministry advised families it would be best for children to stay at home today. Mr Brodie suspects the bug could be norovirus. The school has had a deep clean. 1 in 4 COVID-positive Victorians were not self-isolating at home when visited by Defence Force personnel yesterday. The ABC's Yvette Gray reports.
8 more people have died and 627 new coronavirus cases have been reported in the past 24 hours. 4 deaths are linked to aged care facilities and 2 men were aged in their 50s. Yesterday, authorities door-knocked more than 500 homes of those who tested positive. More than 100 people didn't answer and were referred to Victoria Police. Premier Daniel Andrews says he's waiting for a detailed analysis of the state's coronavirus cases before imposing further restrictions.
These numbers are still far too high. We could not open up with these numbers.
349 people are in hospital, including 37 in intensive care.
Yvette Gray reporting. Failed Dunedin financial advisor Barry Clue will spend at least 5 years behind bars over his Ponzi scheme, which defrauded investors of more than $15 million. The 57-year-old appeared in the Dunedin District Court today, where he was jailed for 8 years and 10 months on 11 charges. Victims detailed how he stole and squandered their savings and investments on a luxury lifestyle. One woman told the court Clue stole more than $700,000 from her and her dying husband. It's coming up to 5 minutes past 5. The Warriors winger Patrick Herbert is backing a more aggressive approach from his side for the remainder of the National Rugby League season. Lone player Jack Hetherington drew attention last weekend when he sparked a scuffle with the well-known enforcer Jared Waerea-Hargreaves in the New Zealand team's loss to the Roosters. Ahead of tonight's clash with the Tigers in Sydney, Herbert says that kind of on-field intent can give a team an advantage.
Rugby league is a physical game, and if you're more aggressive, I think you're going to have a better day and your team's going to go better. Aggression is, we all need to bring that. We're not going out there to cuddle each other.
Kick-off between the Warriors and Tigers is at 8 o'clock. The Blues and Highlanders have taken contrasting approaches with their first 5 selection for Sunday's Super Rugby Aotearoa clash in Dunedin. All Black star Beauden Barrett has retained the number 10 jersey for the Blues, with Otere Black on the bench. The Highlanders, however, have made a change at first 5, bringing Josh Ioane in to start and sending Mitch Hunt to fullback. Both teams have made only one other change to their 23. All Blacks prop Karl Tu'unukuafe has been named for his first start of the competition for the visitors, and utility back Bryn Gatland comes onto the Highlanders bench. Formula One driver Sergio Perez will miss Monday's British Grand Prix after testing positive for COVID-19. The Racing Point team member from Mexico is the first driver to test positive since the season started this month. That's the news.
Tomorrow morning, combative director Oliver Stone on his formative experiences, his parents' divorce, Vietnam. Eating fish, we've been told, made you brainy. Turns out that fish are themselves brainy. Fish cognition expert Callum Brown. And what is QAnon? A group of unhinged fringe dwellers or a threat to democracy? Adrian Lafrance has been investigating. Join me, Ken Hill, tomorrow morning from 8 on RNZ National.
Now the short forecast from Met Service to midnight tomorrow. Northland, Auckland, Coromandel, Bay of Plenty and Gisborne. Mostly cloudy with isolated light showers. Waikato, Waitomo, Taumaranui, Taranaki, Taupo and Hawke's Bay. Mostly cloudy, isolated showers developing in Hawke's Bay tomorrow night. For the remainder of the North Island, mostly fine with high cloud. Nelson, Buller and Westland north of Fox Glacier, mostly cloudy with isolated showers, however remaining dry in Buller. Southern Westland and Fiordland, periods of rain, heavy at times, easing tomorrow afternoon. Marlborough and Canterbury, high cloud. Otago and Southland, mostly cloudy with scattered rain. Chatham Islands, mostly cloudy. RNZ National, 7.5 minutes past 5.
Thanks, Susanna. First up tonight, a damning report into Operation Burnham has found that a child was likely killed during the 2010 raid of an Afghan village, and that the Defence Force misled the public and ministers. The Attorney-General has released the findings of the inquiry sparked by allegations made in the book Hit and Run. It describes the Defence Force's response as woeful, inexcusable and unacceptable. It says while the operation was professional and legal, and there was no organisational strategy to cover up, the Defence Force knew it may have killed or injured civilians, but continued to tell the public and its minister otherwise. The Chief of Defence says he is deeply sorry and says frontline troops were let down by their senior commanders. Here's our political reporter Yvette McCullough.
Attorney-General David Parker says the public's trust in the Defence Force will be shaken by the revelations in this report.
New Zealanders, I think, will be shocked at some of the conclusions reached by this report. In respect of command structures and transparency through to government, they will have proper questions.
The inquiry found that 7 men were killed, 3 of whom were identified as insurgents. 2 others had links to insurgents, but no firm conclusion was reached, and it could not be determined whether the 2 others were civilians or not. A young girl was also likely killed, but not the girl Fatima depicted in the book. The report found that the operation complied with rules of engagement and international humanitarian law. Mr Parker says the most damning conclusion in the report is that the Defence Force continued to say concerns about civilian casualties were baseless, even when they knew that was wrong.
NZDF continued to repeat its incorrect statements, both publicly and to ministers, due to failures of organisational structure, systems and culture. NZDF personnel edited out of reports from Afghanistan that there may have been civilian casualties.
The report says a senior SAS officer displayed an inexcusable lack of care and rigour in misrepresenting the findings of a report which said civilian casualties were possible. This was accepted without question by his superiors, despite contradicting evidence being available. Mr Parker says these failings undermine civilian control of the military and ministerial accountability. The inquiry also confirmed that an insurgent, Kari Mirage, was punched in the stomach by an NZSAS member.
The assault was not as serious as portrayed in the book, but in saying that, I'm in no way attempting to downplay it. Any assault in these circumstances is unacceptable.
Despite strong evidence Mirage was tortured after he was placed into Afghan custody, the report found senior leaders and ministers were not briefed and no further action was taken. It says this breached obligations under the Geneva Convention. Mr Parker says while the report finds that the hit-and-run book contains many inaccuracies, in important aspects, it was right.
Without the book, the findings of the report and its important recommendations would not have been possible. Given this, it is right to acknowledge that the book has performed a valuable public service.
One of the book's authors, John Stevenson, says he feels vindicated.
They had evidence, they had video footage indicating that civilians had died and were injured, including video of a child's body, and yet that information was withheld.
However, he's concerned the severity of the report's criticisms aren't being fully conveyed.
I'm concerned that they're being downplayed by the Defence Force, not only initially and throughout the inquiry, but even now it seems like the Attorney-General is not really prepared to accept the extent to which the inquiry has condemned some of the actions of the Defence Force.
Air Marshal Kevin Short has acknowledged and apologised for the errors he says were compounded over several years.
We let our frontline people down through a series of organisation and administrative failings that saw incorrect information provided to ministers and to the New Zealand public. And for that, I am deeply regretful.
The inquiry makes several recommendations, including a review of the Defence Force's organisational structure and the establishment of an independent watchdog. Air Marshal Short says he accepts and welcomes the recommendations.
We must be better at the way we record, store and retrieve information and then subsequently present that information to ministers and the public. We must be more professional in the way in which we support our frontline troops. I will ensure that this happens.
Defence Minister Ron Mark says he has confidence in Air Marshal Short and his commitment to transparency and accountability. He says it's critical to maintain public confidence in the Defence Force that the harsh lessons highlighted in this report are applied. From Parliament for Checkpoint, Yvette McCullough.
The inquiry also criticised the Defence Minister at the time, Dr Wayne Mapp, saying he failed to correct the public record even after he was told civilian casualties were possible. The report said it was a significant departure from the standards expected of ministers. I asked Dr Mapp to explain how that happened.
I received a briefing from Colonel Blackwell, which I forgot about that I'd ever received it for years and years and years, and it was only during the particular circumstance of the inquiry that it actually came back to me. When I received that briefing, and I only have a sketchy memory of it, it was obviously pretty limited, I nevertheless should have contacted the Chief of the Defence Force, General Jones, and I should have contacted the Prime Minister's office and said, look, I've had this briefing. There is actually a possibility there were, in fact, civilian casualties. I did not do that, and that was a major failing on my part.
Can we be clear on the timeline here, Dr Mapp, how you were able to forget that detail? Because you were briefed in 2011 and you're telling me that you remembered in 2019?
Correct. Yes, look, I've reflected on this a huge amount as to why it went out of my memory, because it certainly did. It was really the result of what the counsel for the Commission, Christy MacDonald, said to me when she talked about Outlook Diary. And when I checked my diary, which I had under my house, I realised I did get a briefing. It was also very unusual the way the whole thing came up in the hearings itself. And somehow it surfaced back into my memory, and I could remember recalling Colonel Blackwell sitting opposite to me, and I could recall that.
Was
Not
he
much
the
more than
only
that,
other
but I could
person
recall
present at that briefing? Because I'm just trying to get my head around, with all the resources at your disposal as the Minister of Defence, it was a pretty key detail for your portfolio, and there were multiple opportunities for your memory to have been jogged in the years afterwards. I'm looking at a quote here you made to News Hub in 2017 where you said you made it your business to be informed about the type of information that was discussed regarding this operation. So I'm just trying to reconcile how this was able to happen.
I think look, none of us can ever say, none of us can ever remember when we forgot, by definition. So I can only surmise it was the death of Corporal Leon Smith, which occurred about 2 weeks after the briefing, that somehow had the effect of removing it from my immediate memory. It was a very traumatic thing, the death of Corporal Smith, as indeed it was with Corporal Grant as well, and somehow that it went from my memory. I mean, if you talk to John Stevenson, I never mentioned it to him. When the program on Murray Television came up, I had no recollection of it. It went from my memory. Now, that's what happened, and it is unfortunate. But what I should have done is, when I got the briefing, that's when I should have spoken to the Chief of Defence Force. That's when I should have spoken to the Prime Minister's office, because then we would have had a proper discussion.
So when did that briefing happen?
Sorry?
The briefing, after which you say that you should have passed the information on, when did that happen?
That happened in around about September 2011. And Colonel Blackwell used to come to my office from time to time to brief me about current operations, and that was actually all of my memory about those briefings. But in fact, because of the circumstances of the inquiry, it did come back to me. He'd also briefed me on this issue that had occurred a year before.
And so were you the only one told in that briefing, Dr. Mapp?
Yes. The briefings with Colonel Blackwell were always oral, and they were always just him and I.
Do you think then that the
seriousness...
I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm just trying to understand. I'm really struggling to get my head around this. Do you think that the seriousness of the mention that civilian casualties could have occurred wasn't conveyed?
It can't have been, because it went out of my memory. And it did. I mean, it just went out of my memory, and yet it seems, on hindsight, I asked myself, how could that have happened? How could that have happened to me?
And so I
find that, sorry?
I just want to confirm then. So if that was able to escape your memory, do you think there were other significant details while you were in the Minister of Defence role that you forgot? It's quite a significant one.
Yes, and I understand why you say that. And it was look, by definition, I can't remember what I forgot. So, look, it is unsatisfactory. I did fail the Defence Force, and I failed, in fact, my fellow colleagues, and I guess ultimately I failed New Zealand by not taking that briefing up immediately and then allowing a proper process to take place.
Do you apologise then for your role in this incident and the way it was handled?
Well, I let New Zealanders down by not following the proper process, and so in that sense, I do apologise for that. It was, I always like to have thought of myself as someone who actually was across things, and on this instance, I clearly failed.
What about for the victims in Afghanistan? Do you have any messages for them, or should there indeed be compensation for them?
I've always been of the view that New Zealand as a nation owes compensation to the victims. I have always felt that we haven't done enough as a nation to find out. Now we have the report, we have more information, and I think it is now incumbent upon the government, now having got the report, to do more for the villagers.
Who's been hurt most throughout this entire saga, do you think, Dr. Mapp?
Well, the villagers, obviously, because, people were injured and a child in particular was killed. So, and although the inquiry says it was accidental, nevertheless it happened. And because it happened, we have a duty as a nation to make some recompense.
So what's your message to those villagers, their family, those affected?
Well, there's that we are sorry that happened, and that we owe a duty to you. We owe a duty that we owe it as ourselves, as a nation as a whole, that we will do our best to make some recompense for them. And of course, that can never be sufficient because lives have been lost, but we have to do more than we've done.
How convinced are you that this could never happen again through the Defence Force? What changes have been made there, or what needs to happen?
Well, as the report makes clear, there needs to be a better system of recording. There needs to be a better sort of flow of information up. One of the things is that a briefing of that nature probably should not have been the way it was done. We need a more formal system. It's one of the reasons why I support the recommendation for an independent Inspector General, because that would enable these things to be properly investigated in a way that frankly we failed, and including myself, I failed as well.
Just to confirm, in your briefing with Colonel Blackwell, do you think he failed in not conveying the seriousness of his message?
Look, I don't know, because I don't have a good enough recollection of the briefing. And he did come across, and he did brief me. I know he did that. I can't remember much about the briefing, but I know I did get a briefing oral, and that he mentioned that there was a possibility of civilian casualties, but from what I can recollect, it wasn't likely. But nevertheless, he told me that. So he did the right thing. Okay, things could have been done better. That's not so much his fault. That's a system-wide fault. That we did not have proper systems. So I was very pleased to see Air Chief Marshal Kevin Short, who's a man I have very high regard for, saying he's going to fix this.
A system-wide failure, was it sloppy on multiple levels, including your own handling?
Yes, and that's very clear from the report.
That was the former Defence Minister, Dr. Wayne Mapp. And we made repeated attempts to contact retired SAS Commander Colonel Jim Blackwell. He hung up on us and did not answer subsequent calls. It is 22 minutes past 5 and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. Keen for your feedback on anything you've heard tonight, you can text us on 2101, tweet us at checkpointrnz, or email checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. Now to Dunedin, where disgraced financial advisor Barry Clew was today jailed for at least 5 years for running a Ponzi scheme which cost investors more than $15 million. Victims told the court in harrowing detail how the 57-year-old befriended them and defrauded them. Our Otago Southland reporter Timothy Brown was in court and filed this report.
Cancer has been cruel to Chris and I, but Barry, you've matched that cruelty. I've had to rebuild my life, move on from not only losing Chris, but trying to navigate how to do all this on my own without the financial security I should have had that we've both worked and planned for.
That's Karen Churcher. She's only one of the more than 80 victims who have lost money to convicted fraudster Barry Clew. Mrs. Churcher told the court how Clew befriended her and her husband Chris. When Chris was diagnosed with cancer, Clew encouraged them to withdraw Mr. Church's life insurance early and claimed he would use it to provide for the family once Chris had died. Instead, he used it to fund his own extravagant lifestyle and a Ponzi scheme which cost investors at least $15.75 million.
Chris continued to work up until the month before he died. He felt he'd made provisions for us to have choices around whether to work or not, as the expenses and living costs could be covered by the savings and investments we had occurred through Barry. Chris thought everyone would be taken care of. Barry not only stole our money, but my future security and my choices, but he also robbed me of my grief, my right to take time out and just grieve an incredible husband and man.
Mr. Churcher died before ever finding out what Clew had done. He died believing Clew was a trusted friend. Mrs. Churcher, on the other hand, had to pick up the pieces of a future which no longer existed after Clew stole it from her. While her story is harrowing, The court heard she was not alone.
It's absolutely disgusting that our funds, along with other people's, funded such things as cruises, trips to Russia, property, family loans, cars for himself, wife, family, and so the list goes on.
When you've repeated stresses like losing a child, managing disability, and then losing money, it's a challenge. We've had to deal with depression and feel like total fools for allowing this to happen.
We thought we were funding our future. We find it difficult to comprehend that we were in fact funding Barry Clue's present.
I feel incredibly used, and I still can't believe it really. This was a man who, right from the beginning of my communication with him, was only going to use me, almost like a grooming for abuse through theft.
Another victim, who is also suffering from cancer, told the court Clue's theft meant his family is now in debt.
So at 69, I'm working 3 days a week. My cancer has progressed and is incurable. I now have the worry of not being able to work in the future. So our lives now are not what we planned. We had no money to enjoy the time that we have left. The house we had planned on building, the holidays, the trips away, maybe a new car, all is gone.
The court heard even though a $5 million reparation order was made, the possibility of reimbursing any funds is unlikely. Judge Michael Crosby says it's the breach of trust which is most galling for many of the victims, some of whom unfairly blame themselves.
You promised a comfortable retirement. You promised a safe and secure nest egg. You promised financial security, and so they felt looked after.
Who his clients thought he was and who he really is stand in striking contrast.
Issue must also be taken to your references to working hard. Hard work denotes honest toil, and you, sir, on your own admission, have not worked an honest day for 25 years.
He was jailed for 6 years on the lead charge of theft by a person in a special relationship, and a cumulative sentence of 2 years and 10 months jail was imposed on a charge of false accounting. Clue received concurrent prison sentences for his other 9 charges. The judge also imposed a minimum non-parole period of 5 years and 4 months. Outside court, Mrs. Churcher told media she was pleased with the sentence.
I think the judge did really well. I think that there is... I wasn't expecting that much. I think that Barry will probably appeal it, but whether there's grounds for that, I have no idea.
Others were less impressed, but Clue won't be eligible for release until at least July 2025. In the Dunedin District Court, for Checkpoint, Timothy Brown.
Authorities in Victoria will assess data over the weekend to determine whether the state goes into a full New Zealand-style lockdown as the number of infections, especially in rest homes, continues to surge. More than 100 people who have tested positive for the virus were not at home yesterday when Defence Force teams paid a visit. Victoria's Premier Daniel Andrews said that if behaviour continued and the virus continued to take hold in rest homes, a full lockdown might be the only option, but the economy would pay the price. Here's Katie Todd.
Another day, more grim news from Victoria. 627 new infections, 349 people in hospital and 37 in intensive care. And 3 weeks into the 6-week lockdown, Premier Daniel Andrews confirming 8 more deaths overnight.
2 men in their 50s, 2 men in their 70s, 3 men in their 80s and 1 woman in her 70s. 4 of those 8 tragedies can be linked back to aged care.
Mr Andrews said 928 active cases could be linked to aged care homes and more than 1,000 health workers are infected. John Atsarakis says the problem is aged care residents are not being tested. His mother Fortini was suffering from Parkinson's disease when her husband, also her caregiver, placed her in Melbourne's St Basil's Rest Home in June for 2 weeks' respite. Things took a turn for the worst when that time came to an end and the family called to arrange a time to pick her up.
"Oh, you won't be able to take Mum out. One of the staff members is infected." And we said, "What? No one's told us anything."
John Atsarakis says he was told his mother would have to stay and only staff would be tested. She contracted COVID-19 and died alone. St Basil's is now Victoria's largest aged care cluster, and families of its residents are now calling for it to be shut down. Patricia Sparrow is the CEO of Aged and Community Services Australia. She says Victoria's second wave of the virus caught some homes out and there was a shortage of PPE.
We actually should be making sure that we transfer those people who test positive, those first cases in residential aged care that test positive, should be transferred to hospital. They need to be transferred to hospital to get the support that they need, but also so that we as providers can actually stop the spread within the facility and make sure that we don't have it going further. Aged care providers are not hospitals. We're not staffed like hospitals. We're not funded like hospitals.
Daniel Andrews said more than 30 Defence Force teams continued door-to-door checks of people who have tested positive for the virus, calling in on more than 500 yesterday.
Disappointingly, I have to inform you that there were more than 130 unsuccessful visits, so around 1 in 4 people cannot be found at home. There'll be a multitude of reasons for that, but what I can confirm for you is that more than 100 cases have been referred to Victoria Police. It is simply unacceptable for you to have this virus and not be at home. If you're out doing other things, there may be a handful who are out getting some fresh air. That does not explain these numbers. These numbers go well and truly beyond anything like that, and all that will do is spread the virus.
Mr Andrews said he had talked with the Prime Minister Scott Morrison overnight, and the data around the numbers of cases would be analysed to determine if Victoria moves to a full lockdown.
I've got no announcements to make about next steps, but it is important that all of us acknowledge that these numbers are still far too high, and we could not open up with these numbers. We could not open up even with significantly less than these numbers. So it may well be the case, and the data may well bear this out, and the best advice may well come to me, that we need to take further steps, that the steps we've taken are not enough to pull this up.
Meanwhile, New South Wales reported 21 new cases today, and Queensland reported 1 new case, a 27-year-old man who caught the virus after dining at a restaurant attended by a woman who tested positive after returning from Melbourne. There are now grave fears New South Wales and Queensland may also fall victim to a second wave. For Checkpoint, call Katie Todd, TNA.
Coming up on Checkpoint on RNZ National, Republicans reject Donald Trump's suggestion that November's presidential election should be delayed. ACT leader David Seymour blows the trumpets of 5 mates who may or may not make it into Parliament. And why the government bought 12,000 pig carcasses during lockdown. We'd love your feedback. You can text us on 2101 and you can tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ, Facebook us, Checkpoint, or email checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. But first, here's Susana Leatao with the headlines.
The government is considering setting up an independent watchdog for the Defence Force after a scathing report into Operation Burnham in Afghanistan. The inquiry found a child and a number of civilians were killed in SAS raids on 2 Afghan villages in 2010, and the Defence Force misled the public about the deaths. Defence Force Chief Air Marshal Kevin Short has apologised for providing wrong information to the public over a number of years. The government has revealed it spent $5.8 million on pig carcasses, which it donated to food banks during lockdown. The buy-up was due to concerns over animal welfare if the lack of a market for pork led to mass on-farm slaughter. Sylvia Park Mall in Auckland will be deep cleaned tonight after discovering a man diagnosed with COVID-19 in South Korea went to its food court over 2 weeks ago. He also visited several tourist spots and restaurants in Queenstown and Milford Sound. It's unclear how the man contracted the virus, and the health authorities cannot rule out that he caught it in New Zealand. Associate Health Minister Julianne Genter has today launched a campaign to vaccinate 350,000 teenagers and young adults against measles to prevent another outbreak such as the one that took hold last year. A Dunedin financial advisor whose Ponzi scheme defrauded his clients of more than $15 million will spend at least 5 years behind bars. 57-year-old Barry Clue was sentenced to 8 years and 10 months in prison in the Dunedin District Court today. The police are appealing for sightings in the Tasman district of a tramper who is 2 days overdue. Stephen Rainbird set out on a hike in the Cobb Valley near Takaka a week ago and was due out on Wednesday. Residents in the Ohopo area just south of Hamilton are being asked to urgently reduce water use after a problem with a pipeline at the Pukerimu pump station. The Waipa District Council says it's affecting the ability to treat water and people need to save water so reservoirs can refill. Those are the latest news headlines from RNZ National. Our next news and weather update is at 6.
Thanks very much, Susanna. We are turning to business news now with Nicholas Poynton. Kia ora, Nicholas. The Reserve Bank, we'll start with them. They're urging retail banks to loosen their purse strings and keep lending. Can you give us some details?
Yeah, so the Reserve Bank held this briefing today where the Deputy Governor, Jeff Baskin, he spoke to sort of the outlook for the banking sector in light of COVID-19. And the main thrust of what he was saying was that the retail banks need to keep their foot on the gas and keep lending going forward. And if we read between the lines of what the Reserve Bank is saying to the retail banks, it's, look, we've scrapped the LVR ratio, we've cut the OCR, cash is as cheap as it's ever been, we're printing more money, we're pulling all the levers at our disposal to keep the country afloat and keep us through the pandemic, but we need some help from you guys. We need you to do your bit and keep lending, because the reality in a capitalist economy is that the world runs on credit, and if people don't have access to it, all hell will break loose. So I should stress though that Jeff Baskin, he wasn't being scathing of the banks. In a way, he was just giving a warning, because up to date, and he acknowledged this, that the banks have done a lot to help people throughout the pandemic. They've helped with regards to the mortgage deferral scheme. They've helped people restructure their loans. And he acknowledged the fact that, the banks have a lot of bad debt on their books at the moment. And going forward, they're probably going to see a bit of pressure on their profits with such low interest rates. But he says the banks coming into this pandemic, they were well capitalised. They have money in money in rainy day funds, and now's the time to start dipping into that and keep the machine well lubricated going forward. And just one final thing that I think I probably should mention, which will be of interest to people, is that there will be an update on the mortgage holiday scheme next week. That was due to end in September, but the Reserve Bank is conscious that they don't want it to come to an abrupt end. That will have quite an effect on some people. So there is signals that we could expect maybe a smoother transition out of that scheme.
More information to come on that, right?
Yeah.
So yesterday we had the ANZ Survey of Business, and today they released their survey of consumers. What did that find? How are people feeling about their spending?
Yeah, I think what we can glean from this is consumers are telling us what businesses said last night, and that we saw a strong rebound coming out of the lockdown, and it's begun to slow a little bit. The index is at 104.3 for July. In June, there's at 104.5, so really it's barely budged. And just for context, 119 is considered average. But this index does come with a survey, and one of the main questions it asks people is whether they think it's a good time to purchase a major household item. ANZ reckons this is a good measure of how people are feeling about their spending at the moment. And for June, we were actually finally in positive territory for the first time since the pandemic, since we went into lockdown. But in July, we've actually slipped back a bit to zero, which is in recessionary territory. But this is quite interesting because all the anecdotal evidence and data we've had shows that people have been spending like mad at the moment. But ANZ says that a lot of this is pent-up demand, and we're going to see households begin to tighten up the purse strings with the impending wage subsidy coming to an end in September. So households are preparing for that. So long story short, I guess, is we came out of lockdown and people were binge spending like there was no tomorrow, but people beginning to wake, and we're seeing the first signs of a hangover.
Reining it in, right. Thank you for that. Can you take us through what's happened on the markets today?
Yeah, so the NZX Top 50 is up by just under a third, by 36 points to 11,728. The New Zealand dollar is up just slightly to 67 cents, down to 92.8 Australian, and down to 51 British pence. And this week we've been keeping a bit of an eye on gold, and the yellow metal was up by 0.4% to $1,961 an ounce.
Excellent. Thank you so much. That was our business reporter, Nicholas Poynton. Well, Well, to the US now, where top Republicans have rejected President Donald Trump's suggestion that November's presidential election should be delayed. The president believes increased postal voting could lead to fraud and inaccurate results. He doesn't have the authority to postpone the election, but the mere suggestion has ignited a political firestorm, particularly after he repeatedly refused to say whether he'd accept the election result. The president's critics say he's trying to distract from the latest economic numbers. The ABC's Catherine Diss reports.
CNF Catering will address burrito. They do want to deliver it. Okay, that's fine. So
Richard Dubasky is bearing the brunt of America's shattered economy.
It's been a struggle, but we're trying to tread water until business comes back.
He's the general manager of a burrito bar in downtown DC. The coronavirus pandemic has halved his workforce.
At first, everyone was laid off, and then as we opened back up, we brought people back gradually on reduced hours.
The reality of the pain is now finally showing up in official figures. The US economy contracted by a whopping 32.9% in the second quarter, its worst drop on record. But economist Steve Rasciuto isn't surprised.
Markets were pretty much expecting a disastrous number, and they got it. So the initial response of people in terms of panicking over the second quarter was replaced by, I think, too optimistic an outlook for this pace of the recovery. And I think the recovery is going to take time.
As the numbers dropped and America digested the news of 150,000 coronavirus deaths, the US President Donald Trump started his morning spray of tweets with a distraction, an explosive suggestion delaying the November election. His justification, an unsubstantiated claim that mail-in voting will lead to the most inaccurate and fraudulent election in history. Republican senators were again left putting out the fire. Here's House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy.
Do you think that the president was trying to distract or change the subject with his talk of delaying the election? And how do you respond to the GDP?
No, and no one didn't expect the numbers to go down when government shut down. When China lied to the world, not only did people die from it, but economically, the world has been hurt.
Senator John Barrasso, like others, sought to distance themselves from the president.
Delay the vote? What do you say, Mr. Senator?
Well, I think we're going to vote on Election Day, and the lead up to Election Day, it'll be a secure election, and we will, if I can have anything to do with it, we will re-elect Donald Trump.
Any prospect of delaying the election is fanciful. The president would need Democrat approval to change the date. But the president's strategy to distract has worked, shifting at least some of the news cycle away from the multiple crises at hand.
The ABC's Catherine Diss with that report. It is 18 minutes to 6. I'm Nita Blake-Person in for Lisa Owen, and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. We would love to hear your feedback on anything you've been listening to tonight. You can text us on 2101, tweet us at CheckpointRNZ, or email checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. Well, the gruesome prospect of mass slaughters of pigs on farms because of oversupply prompted the government to buy 12,000 carcasses during lockdown and donate them to food banks. Hundreds more papers related to the government's COVID-19 pandemic response were released today. One paper revealed Agriculture Minister Damien O'Connor asked Cabinet to approve a $5.8 million purchase of 2,000 pigs a week. Ruth Hill reports.
With independent butchers, Asian retailers and the food service sector closed in lockdown, half the country's pork market disappeared overnight. New Zealand Pork Chief Executive David Baines says the outlook was grim, both for farmers and for their animals.
It was looking pretty dire. If we've got up to half of our production with no market, that's not sustainable.
As officials noted in the paper, due to the nature of intensive pig farming and rapid growth, pigs quickly outgrow their pens. Mr. Baines says many farms have weekly breeding cycles.
It's not like red meat farming with sheep and cattle, where you can just, leave them in the paddock for an extra few months and send them to the works at a later date. Most farmers have weekly deliveries of pigs to the market.
Supermarkets upped their orders, but that didn't come close to bridging the gap. As well as the risk to animal welfare from pig pens bursting at the seams, the government was also worried about farmers taking matters into their own hands. A ham-fisted mass culling of animals by farmers who were not equipped to do so would likely attract negative media attention and a major public backlash. The government came to the rescue, buying 2,000 pigs a week for 6 weeks to cover processing and related transport costs. The meat has been distributed post-lockdown by the food charity Kiwi Harvest, which supplies 242 social agencies and hundreds of food banks around the country. Its general manager, Wikitoria Blandina Diamond, says food donations took a massive hit in lockdown, with manufacturers closing down and empty supermarket shelves.
Restaurants and cafes were closing down, who would otherwise have provided us with some of their food that was still good for human consumption. So during COVID, we saw a real reduction in the food that was available for us, despite the opposite happening with regards to hungry families and the social service organisations that were supporting them.
Ms Diamond says Kiwi Harvest has so far moved just under 600 metric tonnes of pork to 96 community organisations, which are very grateful to receive it.
So protein is not something that often comes available as part of the food that we're able to supply. So to be able to get a product like pork and deliver sort of 1.5 million meals to over, 530,000 people during that period that we were distributing it is just such a big benefit to the community.
David Baines from New Zealand Pork says it's been a win-win.
We think it was a great outcome in terms of moving pigs off farm, but also placing it to food banks because we appreciate that there were a lot of people who were hungry, and this provided a really great option both for our farmers and for the customers of food banks.
Mr Baines says the industry is exploring export options for pork in future, but due to New Zealand's high animal welfare standards compared with other countries, it's hard to compete on price with foreign producers. For Checkpoint, Ruth Hill.
Last night's One News Colmar-Brunton poll saw the ACT Party sitting pretty on 5%, its highest poll result in more than a decade. And with news that leader David Seymour could bring 5 new friends to Parliament, that got us thinking, who are they and what do they stand for? Our reporter Katie Doyle met with David Seymour, who took the opportunity to blow the trumpets of his mates, who may or may not make it into Parliament.
It's ACT's best poll in 17 years. 6 members could be heading to Parliament as a result. The first, of course, David Seymour, closely followed by his deputy, Brooke Van Velden.
She represents the concerns of her generation, particularly mental health and housing, but through an ACT Party lens.
Brooke Van Velden is a Bikram yogi who enjoys knitting and tapestry in her spare time, but don't let that fool you. She's no stranger to the halls of power, having spent the last 3 years working there, gathering support for ACT's end-of-life choice bill. If elected, Ms Van Velden will focus on reducing generational debt, more affordable homes and better mental health for all.
The government's spending $2 billion each year on mental health services, and yet people are still not happy with that provision. And I want to get away from this idea of just throwing more money at it and it will solve the problem, because it obviously hasn't worked. And so what I want to see, and a policy I've created, is one mental health and addiction agency nationwide, and it would be the sole interface for mental health care for every person in this country.
Next up is hunter, wool spinner and mother of 4 Nicole McKee. David Seymour thinks most of us know her already.
She's been best known for her advocacy in the fair firearm law space.
Ms McKee was a strong critic of the government's new gun law, passed following the mosque attacks on March 15. It's why she decided to throw her hat in the political ring. But it's not the only issue she's passionate about.
Game animal management has become an issue over the last 3 years, more so over the last few months, and we need to address that from inside the House as well.
David Seymour's third friend and number 4 on the party list is teacher Chris Bailey.
Chris was for 15 years a police officer in youth aid. He's been a secondary school teacher for special needs kids, and he's a small business owner.
Chris Bailey is a proponent of personal responsibility and wants to see more support for small businesses following COVID-19. Mr Bailey is a big fan of the country's jazz scene and is a bit of a musician himself.
I play the trumpet in a couple of jazz bands, have done for quite a while now.
not particularly good, but I really enjoy it. And also I played rugby for over 30 years, and I still enjoy following my local team and whenever I can.
For anyone wondering, he supports the Crusaders. At number 5 is little-known sea kayaker, gardener and deck builder Simon Court.
As an environmental engineer, he's come to the conclusion it is innovation, not more regulation, that we require to solve our environmental problems.
A man with a green thumb, Mr Court believes in reducing waste to landfill and wants to see the Resource Management Act replaced. He's also the father of 3 high school-age boys, the youngest with Down syndrome.
I really want to make sure there's a better world for him when he comes out from school and training, a world that's more accepting of people and their disabilities. And I also want to see more opportunities for those people to participate in work, because it is good for their well-being.
And last but not least, for the moment anyway,
James McDowell is a small business owner, a PhD in marketing, someone who works for the Wise Group, a charity where he works on mental health.
He's a self-proclaimed classic liberal who enjoys photography, travel and spending time with his 2-year-old daughter. Mr McDowell says community engagement is key to being a good politician, and he'll do that if elected.
I think it's critically important, particularly with actual lawmaking. You know, in general, members of parliament should be engaging at all times, but when it comes to creating laws that are going to affect people, you really need to know the other side of the equation.
And there you have it. If the polls are right, David Seymour and the 5 friends he may bring with him to Parliament on September 19. For Checkpoint, I'm Katie Doyle.
Each winter, a small team of specialist avalanche forecasters begin their vigil to keep people safe while travelling on the Milford Road. The Alpine Highway to Milford Sound is home to the country's only public road avalanche program. Our reporter Tess Brunton and cameraman Nathan McKinnon travelled into the avalanche zone to find out more.
The Milford Highway is the only road access to one of the country's most iconic destinations. But high above the road is a hidden risk only visible from the skies. Waka Kotahi's Milford Road Alliance manager Kevin Thompson says most are unaware avalanches are so active in Fiordland.
Many people who will visit on a fine sunny day that might be in spring or autumn and they're wondering why we're restricting the road or it's closed. There's no snow on the road, but snow for us is not always on the road. Snow for us is up in the avalanche zones, which you can't see from the main road. So it's a hazard that people can't see. Unless they know it's there, they don't really understand the hazard.
The avalanche program is a team of 5 to 6 people who monitor and manage a roughly 15-kilometre stretch of road in the avalanche zone. Alpine Supervisor Scott Redwood is in charge of the program's operations and says technicians need to have 15 to 20 winters experience to get the job. Their aim is to keep people safe and the road open as much as possible during avalanche season. We had a limited weather window before the wind picked up and darkened clouds reached the Milford Road, using it to fly to Mount Bell Weather Station, perched 1,600 metres in the mountain towering over the operations centre. Most importantly, it's right near the Homer Saddle and Tunnel. It measures and records data, including temperatures, wind speed and direction, with a mounted camera so forecasters can get a view of the snowpack. Walking around in -6 degrees with wind chill and dark clouds slowly moving in, Scott says the weather stations in the area are critical to forecasting, as on-the-ground access can be impossible.
You can log in anywhere, turn it around, zoom in, zoom out, get a bit of a feel for what's going on in the area. We have certain things within our start zones that we zoom in and look at, snow poles and just generally we're watching the snowpack, because it's not like a ski field. You can get your feet in the snow every day. A lot of times you can't fly here in a heli, the weather doesn't let you, so it becomes a remote forecasting operation.
It's a long day for forecasters who start about 6 a.m. and can be on until 7 or 8 at night to provide 2 avalanche forecasts for the day. They also continually monitor the conditions and the data provided by weather stations around the area.
Without these, we'd be dead in the water. We'd be guessing, and it's not a very good game to guess in. You've got to be you got to have good hard data, and it's got to be reliable.
Taking off, large cliffs loom over the road, but the source of avalanches is set back into the mountainside. From the top of Mount Christina, the highest zone to impact the road, avalanches drop up to 1.6 kilometres. Scott Redwood says most others plunge at least a kilometre to reach road level.
Everything that we do is kind of out of sight of the road that we manage, so it's a big burly place up high here, and it's the average tourist going through or whatever would just be totally unaware of what goes on to keep this road functional, basically. Takes a pretty big team of people, and smart people too, to make it all happen.
They use a range of different methods to manage and control avalanches, from the more passive no stopping signs to keep vehicles moving through avalanche zones or road closures to controlled explosives.
Oh, heavy. Yep. Bird and bobs away.
More than 2 tonnes of explosives are used each season, using helicopters to fly into the higher alpine reaches to throw the 3-kilogram bags onto the hillside, triggering a domino effect as the avalanche builds.
We reduce the mass, reducing the hazard. We get it on the valley floor where it can't hurt anyone, and then we clean up and get it open, and then people have got some white stuff to take photos of normally.
Fjordland weather can be very unforgiving on a bad day, with the potential for isolated thunderstorms to sit in the U-shaped valleys. Kevin Thompson says it can be challenging to get a weather window to prevent excess snow from building in the avalanche zone, especially when a series of storms come through.
Closing the road or changing the conditions of the road we never do lightly. So we know the decisions we make affect road users, park users, the businesses in and around Milford Sound and Te Anau, so that's not only tourism, that's commercial fishing. So when we make a call, we make it with all of that in mind, but safety drives that. Safety of our team and safety for the public.
Mr Thompson says communication, teamwork, including working with Met Service and helicopter companies, and trust is key in the high-pressure environment. He says it's been their responsibility to keep people safe since the program started in the 1980s.
And prior to the avalanche program, people had lost their lives in major avalanches, even during the construction of the tunnel. But since the program has been operating, there's been no fatalities, and our job is to keep it that way.
While most of the avalanche risk is out of sight and out of mind, forecasters are prepared for a busy winter that can extend into November. On the Milford Road for Checkpoint, Cortes Brunton, Te Anau.
And if you were listening to that package, do have a chance to go online and check it out, because the pictures are just incredible. That will be on our Facebook page and our website. NASA's new robotic spacecraft, appropriately named Perseverance, has taken off for a 7-month mission to Mars. The aim is not only to search for signs of life, but also bring back rock samples to examine here on Earth. The BBC's Rebecca Morrell reports.
Engine ignition, 2, 1, 0. And liftoff.
The start of a mission.
Launching the next generation of robotic explorers to the Red Planet.
That could finally answer the big question. Was there ever life on Mars?
And Atlas TU has gone to closed-loop control.
The rover is called Perseverance, and it's going to a region that was once covered by a lake.
We now know Mars had an enormous amount of water in its past. If ancient life was on Mars, we have a good bet that we might be able to find it in these sediments. So this is really a life detection mission.
This is the most advanced Mars rover that NASA's ever built. It's about the same size and weight as a small car, and it is jam-packed with instruments. And for the first time, NASA will test a mini Mars helicopter that will try to fly in the extremely thin Martian air.
It's another pair of eyes from a totally different vantage point. Just being able to get to places that we simply can't get to today, right? Really sides of steep cliffs or very steep, crevasses, craters, places like that a rover just can't rove into. I mean, we're going to need to fly.
Another first for this mission is that the rock samples collected will be stored and eventually brought back to Earth. NASA's spacecraft is the last of a trio heading to the Red Planet. China and the United Arab Emirates are already on their way. If they all succeed, it will mean a giant leap in our understanding of Mars.
The BBC's Rebecca Morrell with that report. Very quickly now, some time for your feedback before we come up to the news at 6. This one on the sentencing of Barry Clew, who ran a Ponzi scheme. Jeremy says, when I worked in the criminal justice system, it became painfully obvious that there was one law for the poor and one for the rich, and that white-collar crime has never been punished to the extent that other sectors of the criminal world have been. The system is not a level playing field. Another one, they've got in touch to comment on the interview we had with Dr. Wayne Mapp earlier about the war, the review of the war in Afghanistan. They're questioning the overblowing of spending from $2 million to $7 million into the inquiry.
RNZ News at 6, ngā mihi nui ko Susana Leia tawa tēnei. The Attorney-General believes the findings of a report into Operation Burnham will damage people's trust in the Defence Force. The damning report has found that a child was likely killed during the 2010 raid in Afghanistan, but that the operation was justified. It found that ministers and the public were misled about allegations of civilian deaths, and incorrect statements were repeated even after it was known they were wrong. David Parker says the public will rightly be shocked by the report's findings.
They should have confidence in the fact that the New Zealand SAS on the ground did the right thing, acted completely lawfully, did nothing that was a revenge attack, but in respect of command structures and transparency through to government, they will have proper questions.
Attorney-General David Parker. The food charity Kiwi Harvest says the government's donation of millions of dollars worth of surplus pork has been a boon for food banks around the country. A cabinet paper released today as part of a large tranche of documents on the government's pandemic response show the government signed off on $5.8 million to buy 12,000 carcasses from overstocked farms and donate it to charity. The General Manager of Kiwi Harvest, Blandina Diamond, says demand from food banks has skyrocketed, but donations were down during lockdown.
To be able to get a product like pork and deliver sort of 1.5 million meals to over, 530,000 people during that period that we were distributing it is just such a big benefit to the community.
Blandina Diamond says 600 tonnes of pork has gone to 96 community organisations nationwide. Failed Dunedin financial advisor Barry Clew will spend at least 5 years behind bars over a Ponzi scheme which defrauded investors of more than $15 million. In the Dunedin District Court today, the 57-year-old was jailed for 8 years and 10 months on 11 charges. The judge imposed a 5-year and 4-month non-parole period. Victims told the court how Clew stole and squandered their savings and investments on a luxury lifestyle. Outside court, one victim, Karen Churcher, said she was pleased with the sentence.
I think the judge did really well. I think that there is... I wasn't expecting that much. I think that Barry will probably appeal it, but whether there's grounds for that, I have no idea.
Barry Clew stole more than $700,000 from Karen Churcher and her dying husband. The government wants to have vaccinated 350,000 teens and young adults against measles within a year. Many 15 to 30-year-olds in New Zealand may not be properly immunised, and that's one of the reasons last year's outbreak took hold. Associate Health Minister Julianne Genter has launched a campaign today to try to reach them, but has offered few details about how it will happen. She says that will be up to district health boards to manage, but vaccinations will be available at pharmacies and GPs. Doctors welcome the move, but say it should have happened years ago. A woman stranded on a yacht in French Polynesia with her family says borders are closed around them. The cyclone season is coming and they're desperate to sail to New Zealand. Hundreds of small yacht crews want to sail to New Zealand to wait the cyclone season out. Their representative, the Ocean Cruising Club, has been asking since April for a border entry exemption. Californian Gillian Hall says crews must leave soon.
For us, we're feeling like the situation is fairly dire. None of the choices are very good. We could just abandon our house. That's obviously a possibility for most people, but not one that most people would do, whether they live in a house on land or if their boat is their house.
Gillian Hall says there's a humanitarian obligation and the yachties can quarantine on their boats. It's coming up to 4 minutes past 6. A pair of former All Black stars have signed to play for leading Japanese club Kobe. The reigning top league champions have confirmed the signings of first five Aaron Cruden and fullback Ben Smith. Both are back in New Zealand after stints playing in France, with Cruden rejoining the Chiefs this season and Smith taking time off after ending his international career at last year's World Cup. Kobe won the top league when it was last completed in 2018 with former All Blacks first five Dan Carter in the number 10 jersey. Securing second spot on the ladder remains the aim of the Phoenix over the next couple of weeks in football's A-League. They're currently ahead of third-placed Melbourne City on goal difference, with a top two finish giving them direct entry to the semi-finals. The Phoenix play Western Sydney Wanderers tonight, and striker Joshua Sotirio says there is plenty at stake for both sides.
Well, they're coming on the ladder. I think they can still make the top six, so they're going to give it their all. But we've got something to prove as well, so we're going to give it our all, and it'll be a good game.
Kick-off between the Phoenix and Wanderers is at 9:30. NBA basketball teams knelt and wore Black Lives Matter t-shirts during the US national anthem as the league returned for the first time since its suspension because of COVID-19 in March. Coaches and game officials joined players from the Utah Jazz, New Orleans Pelicans and Los Angeles Lakers and Clippers in protesting against racial injustice and police brutality. Black Lives Matter was also written on the court. The Lakers beat the Clippers 103-101, while the Jazz edged the Pelicans 106-104. That's the news.
Take the pulse of the day's news every weeknight at 10.
Premier Andrews went out today and said, this is like a bushfire now. It is completely out of control.
Live with local, national and international stories as they happen.
I'd say good luck, Harry. I've sort of felt sorry for them, and I couldn't understand really why they swung so badly against her in general.
Lately with Karen Hay every weeknight from 10 on RNZ National.
Now the short forecast from Met Service to midnight tomorrow. Northland, Auckland, Coromandel, Bay of Plenty and Gisborne. Mostly cloudy with isolated light showers. Waikato, Waitomo, Taumaranui, Taranaki, Taupo and Hawke's Bay. Mostly cloudy. Isolated showers developing in Hawke's Bay tomorrow evening. For the remainder of the North Island, mostly fine with high cloud. Nelson, Buller and Westland north of Fox Glacier. Mostly cloudy with isolated showers. However, remaining dry in Buller. Southern Westland and Fiordland, periods of rain. Heavy at times, easing tomorrow afternoon. Marlborough and Canterbury, high cloud. Otago and Southland, mostly cloudy with scattered rain. And Chatham Islands, mostly cloudy. RNZ National, it's coming up to 7 minutes past 6.
Thanks, Susanna. Well, there are grave concerns for Melbourne's aged care sector as COVID-19 cases continue to spread through rest homes in Victoria. Another 627 coronavirus cases were recorded today as many Victorians continue to flout restrictions. Victoria's aged care facilities have been grappling with mass COVID-19 outbreaks, with the latest figures showing 74 elderly residents have died from the virus. Melbourne University epidemiologist Professor Tony Blakely says the curve in cases isn't flattening and further restrictions are likely.
I have previously stated that we would go into a New Zealand-style stage 4, or you call it level 4 lockdown, if we're going to go hard for elimination or our ICU capacity is under threat. I don't think our ICU capacity is under threat until we get to about 2,000 or so cases per day. There is, however, quite a lot of talk in Victoria today, and also between Premier Andrews and Prime Minister Morrison, as I understand it, about what a tighter lockdown might look like. It probably won't be the blunt, to be sort of polite, New Zealand style. It'll be more targeted to the essential worker industries where the case numbers are at the moment. Things are moving quite quickly.
So can you take me through what the lockdown looks like at the moment, or the restrictions at the moment, and how that could change going over the next few days?
It looks quite similar to the level 3 lockdown that you had in New Zealand. So what we've got is people like me as academics working from home. Perhaps about a third of the workforce out there is essential workers. There are some differences. For example, hairdressers are open, residential work sites are open where people are building their houses, as well as commercial building. Bunnings is open. So it's a little bit, it's more than a little bit, is looser than what was done in New Zealand. There is ample scope for tightening up on those essential workers and also workplaces, and also things like department stores. So, for example, shoe shops are still open. There's some stuff like that that could easily be tightened up. However, given where we are,
now 5 months into this pandemic, there's great reluctance to do that because of the economic implications.
So where does that leave you? What are your options? The cases just keep climbing until it becomes unacceptable to continue as is?
I don't think, and I wouldn't advocate that to happen. There will be some tightening up, I suspect, with some of these essential industries. I don't have access to that data, but I know that there are competent analysts within the Department of Health and Human Services here who are looking at that right now. The other thing to remember is it is currently Friday, and we all started wearing masks last Thursday, so the masks haven't had a chance to really kick in yet because it takes a 7-day incubation period plus a few days for the cases to be notified and registered in the system. So I'm optimistic, hopeful that the numbers will turn soon due to no other reason other than masks.
And how seriously are people taking it? I see 130 COVID positive cases who got checks from the authorities yesterday were not at home. Is the message about staying at home getting through?
Well, you gave the numbers there, so the answer is no. That is a minority, of course, but it doesn't take much for this virus to get out and keep climbing, even if it's only a small minority that's not complying with the orders. The Australian Defence Force is now assisting and going on all the home checks each day with the health authorities. They're making it very clear that it's not only about compliance and enforcement, but also ensuring that people have what they need. So, for example, if they needed more groceries, they would do that as well. So there's really trying hard to do both a carrot and a stick approach.
Yeah. Aged care seems to be a really big problem area at the moment. How is it spreading so easily there?
Aged care is a disaster. I'm very concerned about this. In our first lockdown, one of the reasons we did it was to build up our community contact tracing, our testing and our surveillance capacity. Great, and we did. It didn't actually stop the quarantine outbreak, but it was the right thing to do. I, along with many other people, assumed that we would also be doing things in other sectors like in aged care and getting it ready. It appears that the aged care sector was grossly underprepared for what's happened. So, for example, one way to conceptualise this is cleaning crews going to multiple rest homes or aged care facilities in one day. Simple stuff like saying, here's a cleaning crew of 12 people, rather than them going to 6 facilities each day, let's break them into 2, 6 crews of 2 people, and they just go to one rest home. So you don't have people going backwards and forwards across these environments and acting like a vector. That's just one example, but it does appear that there's been hopelessly unprepared, which is also symptomatic of wider issues about casual contract staff, about employment relationships, and also some fairly serious issues even before the COVID pandemic in the aged care sector. And if nothing else, this virus tends to find those parts of your society that aren't functioning very well and really go in for them.
And Tony, if you had the ear of Prime Minister Scott Morrison, what would you be saying to him right now about the action that needs to be taken?
I'd be congratulating him for, as of last Friday, actually agreeing that Australia's goal is to eliminate community transmission. That's fantastic. We've had that announced now. It took a while compared to New Zealand. And then I'd also be talking about the particular strategies. And at the moment, you actually need access to the data. And I know that Prime Minister Morrison and Premier Andrews are in regular contact at the moment about what to do next.
Do you have any tips on what he should do next?
Well, it is easy and tempting, and indeed I would recommend going into a level 4 lockdown, but the economic consequences of that are severe and do need to be considered. However, if this keeps going, the economic consequences of not going into a level 4 lockdown over the long run could be worse than just biting the bullet and getting on with it now.
Students at Mangere College took one for the team of 5 million today, getting a jab in the arm for another deadly disease the country's had a brush with, measles. Many of them are part of a missing group of 500,000 New Zealanders aged 50 to 30 who may not have been fully immunised. That gap allowed measles to take hold last year, infecting more than 2,000 people and then jumping the Pacific to Samoa, where it became deadly. Today, the government launched a campaign to track down and vaccinate the people who hold the key to keeping it out in the future. Health correspondent Rowan Quinn and videographer Simon Rogers were at the launch.
It wasn't that sore. It was just like a tiny pinch.
Year 10 student Vanessa Samaili is one of several students at the pointy end of the fight against measles. Mangere College kids are one step ahead of the latest campaign. They've been catching up since the disease hit there last year. The principal, Tom Webb, says they saw firsthand the disruption it can cause, even with just 2 positive cases at the school.
But we had to contact trace about 200 students, all of who had to have some time off school, with some of them up to 10 days, and that was while we were checking immunisation records or getting them immunised so they were able to come back to school.
Measles is so infectious that 95% of the population must be immune to protect the country from an outbreak. You can catch it by being in the same room where someone sneezed or coughed, even if they left it minutes earlier. Associate Health Minister Julianne Genter says the COVID lockdown may help the new campaign, with many other infectious diseases kept in check. There hasn't been a measles case since the end of January.
This campaign will be running over the next year, and I think given the break that we're having from measles, given the prevention of COVID-19, it gives us a great opportunity to close the gap.
But details are light on how the campaign, called Measles Stop With Me, will be rolled out. The targeted group is challenging to reach once they leave school. They tend to be mobile and don't go to the doctor often. It will be up to district health boards to decide how to best deliver the vaccine in their communities.
It will be available freely in schools, in pharmacies for those over age 16, and there will be vaccinations happening out in the community as well as at general practice.
Doctors are welcoming the campaign but say it should have happened years ago. Many say South Auckland was particularly let down, with authorities seeming to let the disease run there. Nurse Laura Williams has been dishing out the jabs today and says the brush with the measles means there's not an anti-vaxxer in sight.
In we go. Cool. Little bit of a sharp sting, sorry sweets. I think especially in our Pacifica community, they know what happened last year, and they know what happened in Samoa and how it devastated some of those villages. So they know, especially for measles, when an outbreak happens, what can, the negative impacts of that.
17-year-old PJ Campbell says the jab's really not that bad, especially when you remember it could be life-saving.
I don't think anyone wants to get measles, and I don't think any parent want their kids to get measles. So I'd say the best thing to do was, if you're offered the opportunity in school or out in your community and you don't think you've got it, get it.
The good, the bad and the ugly of Oranga Tamariki social work practice was aired by claimants in the Waitangi Tribunal today. It's the second and final day of the urgent hearing into why there is a consistently higher number of Tamariki and Pepe Māori taken into state care. Miriana Johnson was there.
Social workers on the front line, trying to prevent children being taken into state care, have spoken of their frustrations and anguish when working with Oranga Tamariki social workers. Rhonda Tuatari works in South Auckland. She's a social worker of 14 years who appeared at the Waitangi Tribunal hearing today to speak on behalf of the Tamariki and teenage mothers she works with, 80% of whom are Māori. She spoke of one child's removal that made her determined to ensure all Tamariki stayed with their mothers. She arrived at the hospital to find 8 police, a Pākehā male social worker, a very irate whānau and a 13-year-old mother.
And she was told from a midwife or a nurse to go home. You're a young woman, you'll get over it. Devastated me, devastated her, devastated the whānau. This girl was celebrating the fact that she was having a baby. Yes, she was 13, but yes, she wanted this baby. Yes, she loved this baby. She didn't even get to bond with the baby.
Rhonda says she struggles to work with Oranga Tamariki, who she says rely on her to do their work because they can't gain the trust of the mother or whānau. This is all despite the fact that Oranga Tamariki social workers are much more highly paid. But the tribunal also heard of the positive impact being felt where Oranga Tamariki was letting Māori social services take the lead in the care of Tamariki Māori. Katie Murray is chief executive of Waitomo Papakainga, a Māori social service provider in the far north and the first non-iwi Māori organisation to sign an agreement with Oranga Tamariki. She told the tribunal this partnership is grounded in tikanga Māori, but it's taken her decades of pushing government ministers and agencies to get there.
In the 30 years that I've been in social services, the last 2 years have been, in my view, really productive for our whānau and for some of our Māori organisations. But that's not because we sit there timidly and don't participate in the discussions that happens. That's because we're very vocal.
She's hopeful that more partnerships with hapu, iwi and Māori organisations will make a difference to the disparity in tamariki Māori going into care.
I think we're progressing. Oh, they've got a long way to go. Way long way to go. But at least what I can see is that they're willing to go on that journey, and now they're willing to walk alongside us, not in front of us.
Katie Murray spoke of how many Māori staff at the Oranga Tamariki Kaitaia office, including in management, enabled her social service provider to ensure tamariki are placed with carers from their whānau hapu or iwi. Head of the Hastings mongrel mob, Rex Timu, also provided evidence to the tribunal about how many of the original mob members were boys who were abused in state care. He says he wants support from the government in order to help him carry out his whānau first kaupapa in the mob, where importance is placed on safe homes. Mo te hōtaka o te ahiahi, ko Miriana Johnson, DNA.
It is just coming up to 20 minutes past 6. You're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. I'm Nita Blakeperson in for Lisa Owen. Professional wrestling had its heyday in New Zealand in the 70s when On the Mat was a must-see on TV for many. Since then, the likes of WWF and WWE took the world by storm, and New Zealand pro wrestling fans got to know Andre the Giant, Hulk Hogan, Bret Hitman Hart, Jesse, the Body Ventura and The Rock. However, there's an increasing number of New Zealanders trying to get locals back into the ring, as Barry Guy found out.
A couple of nights a week, this lock-up in the Hutt Valley is opened up to members of the Valley Professional Wrestling Academy. Like many gyms around the country, the 25 members of the club are keen on fitness, but also on a little show. It's not something you see very often these days in modern gyms with computerised equipment. Everything is done in the ring. Founders and managers of Valiant Pro, who've organised a competition this weekend, Harry McCormick and Hayden Thiel, were both inspired to get into the sport by the athletes they saw on the TV. They both compete and admit looking back through New Zealand's history in professional wrestling encouraged them to try to grow the sport.
My style went from obviously today's sort of work to going back in time and just working a lot slower, which I like to appreciate and give back, a lot of the old boys like that sort of, when they come and see the shows, they like the old school because it kind of reminds them of when they were going when they were kids, and that's what I like to give back.
Niwa McElroy is one of those doing his best to promote it. He's a local who made it big overseas. 5 years ago, he headed off to Mexico to be a part of Lucha Libre. He was fighting in Britain before COVID-19 forced him home and back into the local wrestling scene. He also caught the bug after watching the stars in the big time on TV.
Just getting into it and kind of just treating it like a hobby, I guess, like everyone else. And then just wanting more all the time, and then just going overseas. Or first of all, moving from Wellington to Auckland, then Auckland to Mexico, then Mexico to England, just always wanting more.
Valley Professional Wrestling Academy has about 25 members, mostly adults, but they do allow a few youngsters to get involved where they can. The sport can accommodate just about anyone.
You've got people who enjoy wrestling because of the athletic side. You've got people who enjoy it because of the drama side. You've got people who just enjoy everything all in one. Some people come from sports. Some people come from absolutely nothing, and they just want to better themselves by learning a craft, and our doors are open to everyone,
At the end of lockdown, it didn't take long for a wrestling card to be organised. And Niwa McElroy is a part of the headline bout where he'll face his mentor, Rough Guts Roddy Gunn, this weekend. It's being held at Wainuiomata Intermediate. Not quite the stadium arenas he has fought in.
I wouldn't compare it to that, but I'm still just as excited as it would be if I'm wrestling in front of 16,000 people or 2,000 people or 20 people, it's exactly the same. So I'm still going to give it 100%, yeah.
Many people will scoff at pro wrestling for what is perceived to be fake fighting. But promoter Hayden Thiel says you can't deny gravity and challenges anyone to get into the ring with them. He says their sport is what you want it to be.
It's just a different type of entertainment. You've got a little bit of everything in there, You've got everything from the action to the drama, just anything that you could expect at a play or a theatre, all the way to a blockbuster movie. You've got everything and it's live right in front of you.
Niwa has promised his meeting with Rough Guts isn't going to be a show, it's going to be serious.
This Saturday, this isn't a pro wrestling match. This isn't going to be anything fancy. This is going to be a fight.
Whatever the outcome, the organisers are hoping this weekend's card will help grow their sport. Harry McCormick and Hayden Thiel, like everyone else, work full-time. Anything they make from ticket sales will be used in the gym.
We're non-profit, so everything that comes through those doors we put straight back into the club, whether it be to better our ring, which is pretty good already, so we probably won't do too much on it, but there are little things that we want to do. Better our gym, you know, it's not the prettiest of places, but it's getting there slowly. We put it all back into the gym. No personal gain. We don't want personal gain. We just want to entertain and have people more interested in the wrestling community around New Zealand, and that's our goal, and I think we're doing pretty good at it so far.
For checkpoint, Barry Guy.
Come on, Barry, go.
If you are listening, be sure to go back and watch that one. It is a fabulous report from Barry Guy there. And from wrestling to netball, we'll wrap on netball tonight. Netball is by far the sport of choice for New Zealand girls and teenagers, and it seems more dads are getting on board. Some are putting their hands up to coach their daughters' netball teams and getting really good results. Sports reporter Bridget Tunnicliffe met a couple of coaches in Wellington who came into it from very different paths.
It's Effie Whātau's third year coaching netball at Samuel Marsden Collegiate School. His 15-year-old daughter Eva goes to the all-girls school in Karori, and he's been coaching her since she was about 10. Effie played indoor netball for New Zealand some years ago, and it seems he's found his calling in coaching.
To be fair, it sort of came naturally to me. I was probably more of a kid myself anyway, so I probably enjoyed their company as well. So I get on with the kids, so it's been fun.
Effie, who coaches the school's Senior A team, says there's never been any problems coaching his daughter.
I think we're just used to it now. We've been together, coaching and playing together for a few years now, so we've got a good understanding that I'm the coach when we're here and I'm dad straight after training and straight after the game.
Effie wants to keep building depth at the college, so likes to include junior players in some of the seniors' training sessions. He also likes to make sure his players are prepared for the rigours of netball.
I am tough on fitness. I believe that you probably play your best netball when you are fit and strong enough, and so we probably don't touch a netball for probably the first month of training.
I hate you for that.
They keep coming back, so hey, it's credit to the girls for sticking in the work, and I think when they start seeing their results, I think it's easy for them to come back, for more.
Effie's daughter Eva Whitfield says it didn't take long to get used to her dad coaching her.
It was a little bit weird because having dad at training, but it was good because he's always been kind of coaching me since I was really small, even when he wasn't officially the coach of our team.
Effie first started coaching Eva and her teammate Sarah Guinea when they went to Karori Normal Primary School. 14-year-old Sarah says Effie keeps them on their toes.
I quite like Effie as a coach because he's just, he's not he just gets to the point and he doesn't mess around.
Effie also runs a program called Boost Netball, teaching netball fitness, which is open to all age groups and abilities. Sarah's mum, Kayla Guinea, says it's no coincidence the team qualified for the New Zealand Secondary School Champs for the first time last year. She says Effie has almost single-handedly enhanced the reputation of netball at the college.
We came here because of Effie. I don't know about anybody else, but he certainly is a force, or the main person behind netball here, and because he's here, we came here.
Down the road at Karori Normal School, Pete McKinney coaches both of his daughter's netball teams. Coming from Scotland, Pete didn't know much about netball when he volunteered to coach about 4 years ago.
No, nothing.
So you're Scottish, so what's your background? Was it more your sport, was it more football?
Watching football, I was actually a rower, so I did rowing with my dad.
Right.
Netball's actually the other side of the family, so no netball in ours, but rowing for me. Yeah.
Pete says he has a newfound appreciation for the sport.
My mother-in-law was a netballer for Scotland back in the day, but I still didn't know much about it. But yeah, you see the skill and the almost brutality you get from when the Silver Ferns are playing.
Pete says coaching has been a good way to get to know more people in the community, and there are lots of resources to help first-time coaches. He says there is a lot of netball talk at home.
Yes, we do. We do. And their aunts and their gran obviously play netball as well. So their cousins play netball back in Scotland. So there's a lot of netball chat in our house.
Pete's daughter, 11-year-old Abigail, has had her dad coach her for 3 years. How do you find having your dad coaching you?
It's different from having other people coach me.
Is it all right?
Yeah.
Do you think he really enjoys it?
Yes.
Katie Christie says Pete has helped nurture her daughter Millie's love for the sport. Like Pete, Katie is from Scotland and says she knew nothing about netball until her daughter started playing.
In Scotland, we missed out. We never actually got to play netball. It was never a sports choice for us. It was either hockey or tennis. So for Millie, it was like a whole new thing for the family, really. But it was really nice to watch her play, and I feel like I've actually missed out because it's such a fun sport to watch. And it's great because we get some boys play as well, and obviously awesome having a male coach.
Both Effie and Pete plan on coaching for a few more years. For Checkpoint, ko Bridget Tunnicliffe-Tene.
And that's it for Checkpoint this evening. From me, Nita Blake Person, and everyone here, have a lovely night.
RNZ News headlines at 6:30. Former Defence Minister Wayne Mapp says he remembered only years later a briefing he was given on civilian deaths during Operation Burnham in Afghanistan. Food charity Kiwi Harvest says a government donation of millions of dollars worth of surplus pork has helped food banks feed people around the country. The government has launched a campaign to vaccinate hundreds of thousands of 15 to 30-year-olds against measles within a year. One person has died and another has minor injuries following a crash involving 2 motorcycles at Nukuko near Whakatane this afternoon. Those are the headlines. Our next news is at 7. Tonight on Nights, a dude called Peter Ehrlich selects the mixtape. Country Life checks out a couple of Cobb cottages and meets a Finnish winemaker who had to leave her home to get a job. Grapes don't grow in Finland. The final of Susie Ferguson's series, The